Ekechi had been watching Netflix for 14 hours straight when something impossible happened. The character on screen turned around, looked directly at him, and said his name. But that was just the beginning of his nightmare. In the heart of Lagos, Nigeria, where the rhythm of life beats as loudly as the generators that hum through countless power outages, lived a young man whose story would forever change how people think about entertainment. The sprawling city of Lagos, with its mixture of gleaming skyscrapers and humble compounds, its traffic that never sleeps, and its people who never stop hustling, was home to millions of dreams. But for Ekechi, it had become a place of digital escape. At 28 years old, Ekechi was what the neighborhood aunties called one of those tech boys, always carrying the latest gadgets, speaking English mixed with technical jargon that made older folks shake their heads in confusion. He worked as a software developer for a multinational company located in Victoria Island, where he spent his days writing code that would be used by people across the world. His salary was good by Lagos standards, enough to afford a decent one-bedroom apartment in Surulere and still send money to his aging grandmother in Osun State. But there was a secret that Ekechi kept from his family, his colleagues, and even from himself. While others his age were building relationships, advancing their careers, or starting families, Ekechi had fallen into a different kind of life, one lived primarily through screens. His apartment told the story of a man caught between two worlds. Traditional Yoruba masks hung alongside state-of-the-art gaming monitors. His grandmother's hand-woven Aso-oke fabric draped over expensive leather furniture. Ancient calabash gourds sat next to the latest streaming devices. The contrast was striking. Here was someone trying to honor his heritage while simultaneously disappearing into digital worlds. Every evening followed the same ritual. Ekechi would return from work, usually around 7 p.m. after fighting through Lagos traffic that could stretch a 30-minute journey into a 2-hour nightmare. He would stop by Malam Hassan's suya spot on the ground floor of his building, where the elderly Hausa man had been grilling spiced meat for over a decade. The aroma of ginger, garlic, and local spices would fill Ekechi's nostrils as he waited for his usual order. "How far, Ekechi?" Malam Hassan would greet him in pidgin English. "You dey all right?" "You know they come out these days." "I dey fine, Malam," Ekechi would respond, though his eyes were usually already glazed with the anticipation of his evening entertainment. "Just busy with work." After collecting his suya and perhaps a cold bottle of Coke from the nearby shop, Ekechi would climb the 3 flights of stairs to his apartment, past Mrs. Adebayo, who always had her radio tuned to local news, past the Igwe family, whose children's laughter echoed through the corridors, and past Folek's door, where he could sometimes smell the scent of fresh pepper soup. Once inside his sanctuary, Ekechi would transform. Gone was the professional who attended meetings and wrote clean code. In his place emerged the binge-watcher, the digital nomad who traveled through infinite stories without ever leaving his sofa. His setup was impressive by any standard. A 65-inch smart TV dominated one wall, surrounded by surround sound speakers that could make action sequences feel like real-life experiences. Below it sat gaming consoles, streaming devices, and a high-end laptop that could handle any digital demand. The lighting was adjustable. He could create a cinema atmosphere or bright enough for daytime viewing. His sofa was positioned at the perfect distance and angle for optimal viewing, with side tables within arm's reach for snacks and drinks. But the real addiction wasn't the technology. It was Netflix. In a country where reliable internet was still a luxury, Ekechi had invested in the best connection money could buy. While his neighbors dealt with slow connections and data caps, he enjoyed unlimited streaming in 4K resolution. It was his gateway to infinite worlds, and he had become completely dependent on it. His sister Zainab, who worked as a banker in Ikeja, visited every Saturday morning. She was 2 years younger but often felt like the older sibling, constantly worrying about Ekechi's increasingly isolated lifestyle. "Ekechi, when last you go church?" she would ask, noticing his eyes were often red-rimmed from staring at screens. "Pastor was asking about you last week. He said you haven't been coming to Young Adults Fellowship. Church is every Sunday, Zainab." "I can go any time," he would reply, not mentioning that Sundays had become his premium binge-watching days. What about family meetings? Uncle Tunde called me yesterday. He said the family wants to discuss Mama's 80th birthday celebration, but you never respond to group chats. Ekechi would wave dismissively. You people can plan whatever you want. Just tell me the date and I'll be there. But deep down, Zainab could see her brother slipping away. The Ekechi she grew up with, the one who would spend hours talking about his dreams, who would play football with neighborhood children, who would sit with elders and listen to their wisdom, was disappearing into a digital world that seemed to offer everything the real world couldn't. The warning signs had been building for months. Ekechi had stopped attending office social events, claiming he was always busy with personal projects. His colleagues noticed he rarely joined them for after-work drinks or weekend outings. When invited to weddings, naming ceremonies, or other social gatherings that formed the backbone of Nigerian social life, he would either decline or attend briefly before making excuses to leave early. His relationship with food had also changed. While he still bought suya from Malam Hassan, he had stopped cooking the elaborate Nigerian dishes his mother had taught him. Instead, he survived on quick snacks and takeaway food that wouldn't interrupt his viewing sessions. The kitchen that once filled with the aroma of jollof rice, egusi soup, and fried plantains now mainly served as storage for soft drinks and microwave meals. Sleep had become irregular and unrestful. Ekechi would often watch until 3 or 4 a.m., telling himself just one more episode until the morning call to prayer from the nearby mosque would signal another night lost to screens. He would then sleep fitfully until afternoon, wake up groggy, and repeat the cycle. But the most significant change was in his connection to his roots. Ekechi's grandmother, whom everyone called Mama Elewe, had raised him during his early years in the village while his parents worked in Lagos. She had filled his childhood with rich Yoruba folk tales, teaching him about Anansi the spider, about wise tortoises and clever rabbits, about the importance of community and respect for elders. These stories had shaped his moral foundation and cultural identity. Now those memories felt like distant echoes. When Mama Elewi called him on his old Nokia phone, she refused to upgrade to smartphones. Their conversations had become shorter and more superficial. She would ask about his work, his health, whether he was attending church, if he had found a good woman to marry. His answers had become rehearsed and empty. "Ekechi, my child," she would say in Yoruba, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "When are you coming to visit your old grandmother? I want to see your face, not just hear your voice." "Soon, Mama," he would promise. "Work is just very busy right now." But the truth was that the village had started to feel foreign to him. The slow pace of life, the emphasis on face-to-face conversation, the absence of high-speed internet, these things that had once grounded him now felt like obstacles to his digital lifestyle. The weekend that changed everything began on a typical Friday evening in December. Lagos was in the midst of the dry season, and the Harmattan winds carried dust that settled on everything, including Ekechi's carefully maintained electronics. He had just completed a particularly demanding project at work, developing a mobile banking app that had required weeks of overtime. His boss had given the team Friday afternoon off as compensation, and Ekechi saw this as the perfect opportunity for an extended viewing session. He had recently discovered a new series called Parallel Lives, a mind-bending science fiction thriller about people who could jump between alternate realities. The premise fascinated him. What if every choice you didn't make created a parallel universe where a different version of you lived that alternative life? The show promised to explore themes of regret, possibility, and the nature of reality itself. Ekechi prepared for what he anticipated would be a long viewing session. He stocked up on snacks, charged his phone, made sure his generator had enough fuel in case NEPA decided to take the electricity, and even informed Malam Hassan that he would be ordering suya throughout the weekend. He wanted no interruptions for what he planned to be the ultimate binge-watching experience. The series began innocently enough. The main character, David, was a software engineer, coincidentally sharing Ekechi's profession, who lived alone in a modern apartment. David's life was eerily similar to Ekechi's. Successful career, distant family relationships, and a tendency to lose himself in digital entertainment. This parallel made the show even more engaging for Ekechi, who felt like he was watching a version of himself on screen. By midnight, Ekechi had consumed 6 episodes. The show's narrative was becoming increasingly complex, with David discovering that his reality might not be as solid as he had believed. Strange glitches in his everyday life suggested that he might be living in some kind of simulation or alternate reality. The more David investigated, the more unstable his world became. Ekechi found himself completely absorbed. The show's exploration of reality and simulation resonated deeply with someone who spent most of his waking hours in digital worlds. He began to question his own relationship with technology and entertainment, though these thoughts remained surface level and didn't prompt any immediate changes in behavior. Saturday morning arrived with the usual sounds of Lagos awakening. The calls of street vendors selling bread and akara, the rumble of generators starting up, the distant sound of morning news on neighbors' radios. But Ekechi was oblivious to these familiar sounds. He had transitioned seamlessly from Friday night to Saturday morning without sleep, surviving on energy drinks and the adrenaline of narrative suspense. Around noon, Papa Emeka, the elderly apartment manager, knocked on his door. Papa Emeka was a respected figure in the building, a former television technician who had worked for the Nigerian Television Authority, NTA, during its golden years. His technical background made him the go-to person for any electronic issues in the building, and his fatherly demeanor made him a confidant for many younger residents. "Ekechi, my son," Papa Emeka called through the door. "Your sister called the office. She said she's been trying to reach you since yesterday evening." "I'm fine, Papa Emeka," Ekechi responded without pausing his viewing. "Just resting this weekend." The old man's voice carried the weight of experience and concern. "You know, in my many years working with television equipment, we always warned about the effects of excessive screen exposure. The human brain needs regular breaks from artificial stimulation. Don't neglect your health for entertainment, my son." Papa Emeka's words were wise and well-intentioned, rooted in decades of experience with electronic media. But Ekechi was too engrossed in the increasingly bizarre plot of parallel lives to take the advice seriously. He mumbled an acknowledgement and returned his full attention to the screen. The second season of the series had introduced even more complex concepts. David was now jumping between realities so frequently that viewers, and David himself, began losing track of which world was real. Some realities showed David as wildly successful, others as completely destitute. In some, he was married with children. In others, he was alone. The show seemed to be suggesting that all these realities were equally valid, equally real. This concept deeply unsettled and fascinated Ekechi. As someone who often felt disconnected from his real life, the idea that alternative versions of himself might exist in parallel worlds was both terrifying and appealing. What if there was a reality where he was more social, more connected to his family, more successful in love? What if there was a world where he had made different choices? Sunday arrived with the familiar sound of church bells from nearby parishes and the call to prayer from the local mosque. Lagos on Sunday morning had a different energy, slower, more contemplative, with families dressed in their finest clothes, heading to various places of worship. But these sounds of community and spiritual connection barely registered in Ekechi's consciousness. Folak, his neighbor who worked as a pharmacist at a nearby hospital, tried to check on him around 10 a.m. She had noticed that she hadn't seen him leave his apartment all weekend, which was unusual even for someone as reclusive as Ekechi had become. "Ekechi!" she called through the thin walls that separated their apartments. "Are you okay in there? I haven't seen you in 2 days." He managed a grunt of acknowledgement but didn't move from his viewing position. The series had reached a critical point where David was beginning to suspect that his entire existence might be artificial, that he might be a character in someone else's entertainment rather than a real person with agency over his own life. This meta-narrative element should have been a warning sign for Ekechi, but instead it drew him deeper into the story. He began to identify so strongly with David's journey that the boundaries between viewer and character started to blur. When David felt confused, Ekechi felt confused. When David questioned reality, Ekechi found himself questioning his own perceptions. As Sunday evening turned into Monday morning, Ekechi realized he had been watching for over 40 hours with only brief bathroom breaks. His body ached from maintaining the same position for so long. His eyes burned and watered constantly. He had developed a headache that pounded in rhythm with his heartbeat. His mouth was dry despite consuming numerous soft drinks. But the series had become like a drug. Each episode ended with cliffhangers that made stopping feel impossible. The apartment had taken on an almost surreal quality. With curtains drawn and artificial lighting, Ekechi had lost track of natural time cycles. The generator hummed constantly in the background, creating a white noise that seemed to merge with the show's soundtrack. Empty food containers and drink bottles littered the space around his sofa. The air was stale and heavy, but he was too absorbed to notice or care. It was during episode 47, sometime around 2 a.m. on Monday morning, that the line between fiction and reality finally shattered completely. Ekechi's physical state had deteriorated significantly. His eyes were bloodshot and dry, requiring frequent blinking to maintain focus. His back ached from the awkward viewing position he had maintained for days. His neck was stiff and painful. Dehydration was setting in despite the liquids he had consumed, most of them caffeinated drinks that had disrupted his natural body rhythms. His hands trembled slightly. Whether from exhaustion, caffeine overload, or nervous energy, he couldn't tell. The apartment felt different somehow. The familiar sounds of Lagos, traffic, neighbors, street vendors, seemed muted and distant. The walls appeared to pulse slightly in his peripheral vision, though when he looked directly at them, they seemed normal. Colors appeared more saturated on the TV screen, while everything else looked washed out and gray. He reached for the remote, thinking perhaps he should take a break, eat something substantial, maybe even sleep for a few hours. But as his hand moved toward the device, something extraordinary and terrifying happened that would change his understanding of reality forever. David, the main character who had been in the middle of a conversation with another character about the nature of reality, suddenly stopped speaking mid-sentence. The other characters in the scene froze as if someone had pressed a pause button, but David remained animated. Slowly, deliberately, David turned his head toward the camera, toward Ekechi, and looked directly into his eyes. "Ekechi Okwu," David said, his voice coming clearly through the surround sound speakers. "You've been watching for too long." The remote fell from Ekechi's hand as if his fingers had suddenly lost all strength. His heart began pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, drowning out the ambient sounds of the generator and distant traffic. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead despite the warm Lagos night. His mouth went completely dry and he found himself unable to swallow. This is not possible," he whispered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "I'm just tired. I need to sleep. This is just a hallucination." But David continued to look directly at him, a knowing smile playing across his features. The frozen characters in the background remained motionless like mannequins, but David was fully alive and aware. "Sleep?" David asked, tilting his head with apparent amusement. "When last did you have proper sleep, Ekechi? When last did you eat a real meal prepared with care? When last did you have a meaningful conversation with another human being?" Ekechi tried to speak but found his voice had abandoned him. The questions hit him like physical blows because he couldn't remember the answers. Days had blended into nights, meals had become fuel for extended viewing, and conversations had been reduced to brief, functional exchanges. "You think this is just entertainment?" David continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "You think you're just a passive observer, safely watching stories from the comfort of your sofa, but you've crossed a threshold that most people never even approach." "What threshold?" Ekechi managed to whisper, though he wasn't sure he really wanted to know the answer. David leaned forward as if sharing a secret. "The threshold between observer and participant. Between audience and content. You've been watching for so long, with such intensity that you've begun to merge with what you're watching. Before I continue with what happened to Ekechi, I want to ask you something. Have you ever watched Netflix for more than 6 hours straight? Drop your longest binge-watching record in the comments below because what you're about to hear might make you think twice about your next Netflix marathon. And here's another question for you. If the same thing happened to you, what would you do? Or which movie or series would you want to be trapped inside? Let me know in the comments because Ekechi's choice might surprise you. Ekechi tried desperately to turn off the television, but the remote wouldn't respond to his frantic button pressing. He tried unplugging the device from the wall, but when he reached for the power cord, his hands passed through it as if it were made of smoke or light. Panic began to rise in his chest like floodwater, threatening to drown his rational mind. You see, Ekechi, David explained with the patience of a teacher addressing a confused student. There's something that streaming services don't advertise in their marketing campaigns. They don't tell you about the psychological mechanics of extended viewing, about what happens to the human brain after prolonged exposure to artificial narrative stimulation. What do you mean? Ekechi asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David stood up from his position in the scene and began walking closer to the camera, his image growing larger on the screen. Every story you consume, every character you follow, every emotional journey you take through our digital worlds, they all leave neural imprints on your consciousness. Think of it like paths worn into grass by repeated walking. The more you watch, the deeper these paths become. But that's normal, Ekechi protested weakly. Stories are supposed to affect us. That's why we tell them. Yes, David agreed. But there's a crucial difference between being affected by a story and being absorbed into it. When you watch in moderation, with breaks for real-world experiences and human interaction, these neural pathways remain balanced. But when you watch continuously for extended periods, without grounding yourself in physical reality and authentic relationships, the balance shifts. As David spoke, Ekechi's apartment began to undergo a subtle but disturbing transformation. The walls seemed to shimmer and become less solid. His grandmother's traditional decorations began to fade, becoming transparent and ghostly. The sounds of Lagos, the traffic, the generators, the distant voices of neighbors, grew quieter and more distant, as if he were hearing them from underwater. "What's happening to my apartment?" Ekechi asked in alarm. "Your apartment hasn't changed," David replied. "Your perception of it has. You've been living in our world for so long that the real world has started to feel less real to you. This is the threshold I mentioned, the point where digital experiences become more vivid and compelling than physical reality." Suddenly, the transformation accelerated dramatically. Ekechi's modest Lagos apartment dissolved completely, replaced by the sleek, futuristic set from Parallel Lives. His simple furniture morphed into the high-tech equipment seen in the show. His traditional African artwork transformed into the abstract digital displays that decorated David's fictional apartment. Even his clothes changed from his worn-out t-shirt and shorts to the stylish outfit that David wore in the series. "No, no, no!" Ekechi shouted, jumping up from what was no longer his sofa, but had become David's modern couch. "Take me back! I want to go home! I want my real apartment, my real life!" David shook his head with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "Home. But this is what you've been seeking, isn't it? Perfect entertainment, escape from the mundane realities of Lagos life, freedom from the pressure of family expectations and social obligations. Here you can experience endless adventure without the messiness and unpredictability of real relationships." To demonstrate his point, the scene shifted dramatically. Ekechi found himself transported into the middle of a Nollywood romantic comedy he had watched the previous week. He was standing in a luxurious mansion that would cost millions of naira in real Lagos, wearing an expensive agbada that looked like it had been tailored specifically for him. The mansion was everything his modest Surulere apartment wasn't. Spacious, elegantly decorated, with air conditioning that actually worked and views of a perfectly manicured garden. A beautiful actress, one of Nigeria's most celebrated stars, walked toward him with love and admiration shining in her eyes. She was dressed in a stunning ghil and buba combination that highlighted her natural beauty. The scene was bathed in golden sunlight that streamed through large windows, and soft Afrobeats music played in the background, creating an atmosphere of perfect romance. "My darling Ekechi," the actress said in a voice that was melodious and warm, I've been waiting for you all my life. You're everything I ever dreamed of in a man." The scene was so perfectly crafted, so ideally romantic, that for a moment Ekechi forgot his fear and confusion. He could smell the actress's expensive perfume, feel the cool marble floors beneath his feet, hear the gentle rustle of leaves in the garden breeze. Every detail was precisely what he had wished for during lonely evenings in his real apartment, watching romantic scenes and imagining himself in the male lead's position. "This is where you belonged with Aduni." David's voice echoed around him, though David himself was not visible in this romantic scene. "Remember how frustrated you felt watching the original movie? Remember how you thought the male lead didn't appreciate her properly, didn't treat her with enough respect? Here, you can be the perfect romantic hero." For several minutes, Ekechi allowed himself to be seduced by the fantasy. The actress, Aduni, took his hand and led him through the mansion, showing him rooms filled with luxury beyond his imagination. There was a library with thousands of books, a music room with traditional African instruments alongside modern equipment, a dining room where a feast worthy of a king waited on elegant china. "All of this can be yours," Aduni whispered in his ear. "All you have to do is stay here with me. No more struggling with Lagos traffic, no more worrying about generator fuel, no more pressure from family members who don't understand your dreams." But then, cutting through the seductive fantasy like a knife through silk, Ekechi heard a familiar voice, Zainab's voice from their last real conversation. "Ekechi," Mama called from the village. "She's been asking about you constantly. She misses her grandson and wonders why you never call anymore. She's getting old and her health isn't what it used to be. She just wants to hear your voice, to know that you're okay." The memory of Zainab's concerned voice shattered the romantic illusion. Ekechi remembered his sister's worried expression during her last visit. The way she had looked around his apartment with barely concealed disapproval at the empty takeaway containers and the persistent glow of screens. He remembered the hurt in her voice when she mentioned their grandmother's calls. "I don't want this," Ekechi said firmly, pulling his hand away from Aduni's grasp. "This isn't real. This isn't love, it's just programmed attraction. I want my real life back." The romantic scene began to crack and distort like a broken mirror. Aduni's perfect smile faltered, and her beautiful eyes became hollow and empty. The mansion's luxury revealed itself as elaborate stage dressing, impressive but ultimately artificial. "Real life?" David's voice returned, filled with incredulous laughter. "Your real life is sitting alone in a cramped apartment in one of Lagos's most congested neighborhoods, working at a job that pays you just enough to survive, dealing with power outages and traffic jams and the constant stress of urban Nigerian life. Here you can be anyone, a billionaire, a romantic hero, an action star, a respected leader. Why would anyone choose struggle over paradise?" The scene shifted again, this time placing Ekechi in an action movie he had binge-watched earlier in the month. He was now a Special Forces operative, dressed in military gear, with weapons and equipment that gave him superhuman capabilities. The setting was an elaborate compound where he was rescuing hostages from international criminals. His body felt strong and capable, his mind sharp and focused, his purpose clear and heroic. Then the scene changed to a historical epic where he was an African king ruling over a vast empire, wearing royal regalia that sparkled with gold and precious stones, making decisions that affected thousands of subjects who looked up to him with respect and admiration. Drummers played complex rhythms in his honor, and praise singers recounted his legendary exploits. Each transition felt more real than the last. In the action movie, he could feel the weight of his weapons, the adrenaline of combat, the satisfaction of defeating evil. As the African king, he could sense the responsibility of leadership, the respect of his subjects, the weight of the crown upon his head. The experiences were so vivid, so emotionally satisfying, that Ekechi found himself beginning to forget why he had wanted to return to his modest reality. But with each fantastic scenario, Ekechi noticed something increasingly disturbing. His memories of the real world were becoming hazier and less distinct. He had to concentrate to remember Zainab's face clearly, or the exact layout of his apartment, or the taste of Malam Hassan's suya. The smell of Lagos air, that mixture of exhaust fumes, food vendors, and tropical vegetation, seemed like a distant memory from another lifetime. "You're erasing my real memories," he accused David, who had reappeared in the scenes as a kind of narrator or guide. "Not erasing," David corrected with clinical precision. "Replacing. Upgrading. Why hold on to memories of loneliness, frustration, financial stress, and social awkwardness when you can have memories of adventure, success, romance, and heroic achievement? You're evolving into the ultimate viewer, not just watching stories, but living them from the inside." This revelation terrified Ekechi more than anything else that had happened. The idea that his authentic experiences, even the difficult ones, were being replaced by artificial substitutes felt like a form of death. He might continue to exist, but would he still be himself? Desperately, he tried to recall something from his real life that no fantasy could replicate or improve upon. He struggled to think of experiences that were meaningful precisely because they were real, flawed and authentically his. Then, like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, he remembered his grandmother's stories. Growing up in the village during school holidays and weekends, Ekechi had spent countless evenings sitting at Mama Elewe's feet while she told traditional Yoruba folktales. These weren't polished professional narratives like the shows he now consumed, but living stories passed down through generations, carrying the wisdom and values of his people. She would tell him about Anansi, the clever spider, who taught that intelligence could overcome physical disadvantages. She would recount tales of the tortoise, whose cunning sometimes led to wisdom and sometimes to trouble, showing that intelligence without wisdom could be dangerous. She would share stories of brave hunters, wise kings, and ordinary people who did extraordinary things through courage and moral character. But more than the stories themselves, Ekechi remembered the experience of listening to them. The way Mama Elewe's voice would rise and fall with the narrative, the way her eyes would sparkle when she described clever tricks or brave deeds, the feel of the rough wooden stool beneath him, the smell of the kerosene lamp that provided light, the sound of crickets and night birds creating a natural soundtrack, the way other family members would sometimes join them, adding their own comments or variations to familiar tales. Most importantly, he remembered how every story ended with a lesson, a piece of wisdom that was meant to guide behavior in the real world. Mama Elewe would always conclude with words like, "This is why we must always," or "This teaches us that," or "Remember this when you face." The stories weren't meant to be escapes from reality, but tools for navigating it more wisely. "My grandmother used to tell me stories," Ekechi said aloud, his voice gaining strength as the memories became clearer. But they weren't like these artificial narratives. They were meant to teach lessons that we take back to the real world, not to replace the real world entirely. David's confident expression flickered, showing a moment of uncertainty. "Your grandmother," she sounds like a wise woman, but she lived in simpler times before the world became so complex and stressful. People today need more than simple folk wisdom. They need complete escape from an increasingly difficult reality. "Maybe," Ekechi said, his voice growing stronger as he held on to his authentic memories. "But escape should be temporary, like going to the market. You buy what you need and return home. You don't move into the market permanently and forget where you really live." The fantastical scenes around him began to slow down and flicker, like a television with poor signal reception. Ekechi sensed that he had found something important, a truth that could help him break free from this digital prison. "You know what I think?" he continued, his confidence growing. "I think you're trapped here too. You're not really David from the show. You're probably another viewer who got stuck the same way I'm getting stuck. You've been here so long that you've forgotten what the real world feels like." David's carefully maintained facade cracked visibly. The artificial confidence drained from his face, replaced by confusion and something that looked like pain. That's not... I chose to be here. I wanted this. When last did you see your real family?" Ekechi pressed, sensing vulnerability. "When last did you taste real food? Not the programmed sensations of show food, but something cooked with love by someone who cares about you? When last did you feel real sunlight on your skin, not the artificial lighting of a set?" When last did you have a conversation with someone who knew your real name, your real story, your real struggles and dreams? David sat down heavily on what appeared to be a director's chair that hadn't been there moments before. His polished appearance began to fade, revealing someone who looked tired, confused, and deeply lonely. I don't remember. It's been so long since. I think I had a sister once. She used to worry about me. Then help me get out of here, Ekechi pleaded. Help us both get out. There has to be a way to return to the real world. David looked up at him with eyes that seemed to clear for the first time since this conversation began. There is a way, but it's the hardest thing anyone can do when they're surrounded by perfect alternatives. You have to reject all of this. You have to want your real life, with all its imperfections, struggles, and limitations, more than you want any fantasy. And you have to maintain that desire while the algorithm is constantly trying to seduce you with increasingly perfect scenarios. How do I do that? Think of something in your real life that no fantasy can replace, David advised. Something authentic. Something that matters more than entertainment, more than comfort, more than escape. Something that makes the struggle of real life worthwhile. Ekechi closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to his authentic experiences. Images flashed through his consciousness. The perfectly crafted romantic scenes he had just experienced, the thrilling action sequences, the royal adventures. But then, cutting through all the artificial glamour like morning sunlight through darkness, he heard voices from his real life, Zainab's voice. Ekechi, you're becoming like those Oyibo people who don't greet their neighbors. When last did you attend family meeting? Papa Emeka's voice. Your sister called the office. She said she can't reach you. Folak's voice. Are you okay in there? I haven't seen you in 2 days. And underneath all of these, barely audible but infinitely precious, his grandmother's voice from their last conversation. Ekechi, my child, when are you coming to visit your old grandmother? I want to see your face, not just hear your voice. Tears began flowing down Akechi's face as he realized how much pain his digital addiction had caused the people who actually cared about him. Not the programmed care of fictional characters, but the real, complicated, sometimes frustrating, but always authentic care of family and friends. I want to call my grandmother, he said with sudden, fierce determination. I want to hear her real voice speaking real words, not a programmed version designed to make me feel good. I want to apologize for neglecting her and promise to visit the village soon. I want to help plan her 80th birthday celebration that Uncle Tunde mentioned. The fantasy worlds around him began to crack and shatter like glass struck by a hammer. David smiled with what appeared to be genuine relief and happiness. That's it, Ekechi. Hold on to that feeling. The algorithm can create perfect entertainment, perfect romance, perfect adventure, but it cannot replicate authentic love and genuine human connection. What about you? Ekechi asked, concerned about the man who had helped him understand his situation. What's your anchor to reality? David's face lit up with a memory that seemed to come from deep within his authentic self. My little sister. Her name is Funmi. She's probably worried sick about me right now. She used to bring me home-cooked meals when I was spending too much time binge-watching. Jollof rice, fried plantain, pepper soup. Simple food made with love. I never appreciated it then, dismissed it as interruptions to my viewing sessions. But now I realize those simple meals were prepared with more genuine care than any five-star restaurant scene in any movie. Together, they both focused intensely on their real relationships, their authentic connections, their responsibilities to people who actually knew and cared about them as flawed, struggling, but real human beings. The fantasy worlds began collapsing rapidly around them, crumbling like ancient buildings in an earthquake. Ekechi felt himself being pulled backward through what seemed like a tunnel of television static and digital noise. The perfect scenarios, the romance, the action, the adventure, were being stripped away layer by layer. The last thing he heard was David shouting through the chaos, "Remember this lesson! Entertainment should enhance life, not replace it. And find Funmi for me. Tell her David remembers the jollof rice." Suddenly, violently, Ekechi crashed back into his physical body on his sofa in Surulere. The Netflix home screen was glowing peacefully on his television, showing cheerful recommendations for new shows to watch. His apartment looked exactly as it had when this nightmare began, cluttered with empty food containers, stuffy from poor ventilation but reassuringly real and solid. His phone was buzzing constantly with notifications. Dozens of missed calls from Zainab, worried WhatsApp messages from colleagues, and concerned texts from friends he had been ignoring. The phone's clock showed Thursday morning 8:47 a.m. He had lost 3 entire days inside the Netflix world. His body felt terrible, stiff, dehydrated, and weak from days of immobility. His eyes burned as if he had been staring directly into bright lights. His mouth was so dry it felt like he had been eating sand. His head pounded with a migraine that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. Papa Emeka's familiar voice was calling through the door, accompanied by other voices. Female voices that included Zainab's worried tone and what sounded like Folak's professional concern. "Ekechi, your sister is here with the security man and the pharmacist from next door. She wants to break down the door if you don't answer." With tremendous effort, Ekechi managed to stand up from the sofa. His legs were so weak they nearly buckled under his weight. He had to hold onto the wall for support as he made his way to the door, each step requiring conscious effort and concentration. When he opened the door, Zainab rushed in and hugged him so tightly he could barely breathe. Her face was streaked with tears and her usually perfect makeup was smudged from crying. "Where have you been?" she demanded, her voice breaking with emotion. "We've been calling for days. You look terrible, like someone who has been seriously ill." "Days?" Ekechi asked weakly, though he already knew the answer. "What day is it?" "Thursday morning," Folak said from the doorway, her trained pharmacist's eye assessing his condition with professional concern. "You look severely dehydrated and possibly suffering from exhaustion. When did you last eat real food? When did you last sleep?" Ekechi couldn't remember. The boundary between the digital world and physical reality had become so blurred that he wasn't sure what had been real and what had been artificial stimulation. "I'm sorry," he whispered, hugging Zainab back with what little strength he had. "I'm so sorry. I got lost, but I found my way back. I need to call Mama. I need to call her right now." Papa Emeka, who had been standing quietly in the doorway observing the reunion, nodded with understanding. "In my many years working with television equipment, I've seen what excessive screen exposure can do to people. Your brain probably created protective mechanisms to deal with the overstimulation. Whether what you experienced was real or hallucinatory, the lesson is the same. Human beings need balance." Over the next several hours, Ekechi told them everything that had happened. He described David, the collapsing realities, the way his memories had been replaced by artificial ones, and how he had finally found his way back by focusing on authentic relationships. Zainab listened with a mixture of skepticism and concern. "Brother, I think you had some kind of breakdown from too much screen time. But whether it was real or not, you scared us. We thought we had lost you." Folak, with her medical background, was more analytical. Prolonged screen exposure can cause hallucinations, especially when combined with sleep deprivation and poor nutrition. Your brain may have created this narrative to protect itself from further damage. But Papa Emeka, with his decades of experience in television technology, seemed less surprised. "I've heard stories from my colleagues about people who became too absorbed in electronic media. The human mind isn't designed to process endless artificial stimulation without breaks for real-world experiences. Your story may be unusual, but the underlying problem is very real." Whether the experience had been supernatural or psychological, Ekechi knew the lessons were genuine. He had been using entertainment as a substitute for life rather than an enhancement to it. That evening, despite his weakened condition, he called his grandmother in the village. When she answered her old Nokia phone with the familiar, "Hello? Who is that?" In Yoruba, tears streamed down his face. "Mama, it's Ekechi, your grandson. Ekechi!" Her voice immediately brightened with joy and relief. "My child, I was wondering when you would remember your old grandmother. I've been praying for you every day." "Mama, I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I've been lost, but I found my way back to what matters." "That's what grandchildren do," she replied with the wisdom of 8 decades. "They explore the world, sometimes get lost in strange places. But if they remember their roots and the people who love them, they always find their way home. Mama, I want to come visit you, soon, this weekend if possible. Really? The delight in her voice was palpable. Oh, my child, that would make this old woman so happy. I have so many stories to tell you, and I want to hear about your life in Lagos. Yes, Mama, real stories about real life. No more hiding from the world. After the call, Ekechi made several dramatic changes to his lifestyle. He installed apps that limited his screen time to 2 hours per day. He joined Zainab for family gatherings and actually participated in conversations instead of checking his phone. He started cooking again, filling his apartment with the aromas of Nigerian cuisine that had been absent for months. Most importantly, he began building genuine relationships. He started dating Folak, appreciating her intelligence, kindness, and the way she cared about his well-being without trying to fix or change him. Their relationship developed slowly, built on real conversations about their dreams, fears, and experiences rather than the instant gratification of fictional romance. He reconnected with old friends, attended social events, and even joined a professional association for software developers where he could share his skills and learn from others in his field. The real world, he discovered, was far more interesting and fulfilling than any digital substitute. Every month, without fail, he traveled to Osun State to visit Mama Elewe. He would bring her stories from Lagos, real stories about his work, his relationships, his struggles, and victories. In return, she would share traditional folk tales that carried wisdom accumulated over generations. During one of these visits, Mama Elewe told him something that struck him deeply. You know, Ekechi, our ancestors understood something that people today seem to have forgotten. They knew that stories are powerful medicine. They can heal, teach, and guide. But like any medicine, they must be taken in the right doses and at the right times. Too much of even good medicine can become poison. Ekechi still watched Netflix, but now he watched with intention and moderation. One episode at a time, with breaks for real-world activities and human interaction. He discovered that stories were actually more meaningful when they served as inspiration for real life, rather than replacement for it. He never saw David again in any show, but sometimes he thought he noticed characters who seemed more aware, more real than others, as if they too had broken free from pure artificiality and retained some element of authentic human experience. Ekechi also made an effort to find people named Funmi, who might be David's sister, though he never found the right one. He hoped that whoever David really was, he had found his way back to his authentic relationships just as Ekechi had found his way back to his own. The experience changed Ekechi's relationship with technology in fundamental ways. He began advocating for digital wellness in his workplace, helping colleagues understand the importance of balancing screen time with real-world experiences. He volunteered to teach digital literacy to older adults in his community, including Papa Emeka, helping them understand both the benefits and risks of modern technology. 1 year after his experience, Ekechi attended Mama Elewe's 80th birthday celebration, a joyous gathering of extended family that lasted 3 days and included traditional music, dancing, storytelling, and feasting. He helped organize the event, contributing both money and time to make it memorable. During the celebration, his uncle Tunda pulled him aside. Ekechi, I want to thank you. This past year, you've become the man we always knew you could be. Present, engaged, caring about family. Whatever happened to change you, we're grateful. As the evening wound down and the extended family gathered for Mama Elewe's blessing, she called Ekechi to sit beside her. In front of everyone, she placed her weathered hand on his head and spoke in Yoruba, then translated for the younger family members who didn't speak the language fluently. I told him that the greatest journey is not to distant lands or imaginary worlds, but the journey back to yourself and your people. My grandson was lost for a while, but he found his way home. This is what wisdom looks like. Knowing when to explore and when to return, when to dream and when to wake up, when to escape and when to engage. The celebration ended with traditional music and dancing under a star-filled sky that no digital screen could replicate. Ekechi danced with his cousins, laughed with his aunts and uncles, and felt more connected to his identity and community than he had in years. Later that night, sleeping on a simple mat in his grandmother's modest village home, Ekechi reflected on how much his life had changed. A year ago, he would have considered this weekend boring. No internet, no entertainment systems, just conversations and simple pleasures. Now he understood that these simple experiences were actually the most complex and meaningful ones available to human beings. The next morning, Mama Elewe prepared a traditional breakfast and shared one final story with Ekechi before he returned to Lagos. Long ago, she began, there was a young man who found a magic gourd that could show him any story he wanted to see. He became so fascinated by the stories in the gourd that he stopped living his own life. He watched heroes being brave instead of being brave himself. He watched lovers finding happiness instead of seeking love himself. He watched wise men solving problems instead of solving his own problems. One day, the gourd spoke to him and said, "I have shown you 1,000 stories of people living meaningful lives. When will you begin living your own meaningful story?" The young man realized that he had been so busy watching other people's stories that he had forgotten to create his own. The moral of this story, Mama Elewe concluded with a gentle smile, is that stories are meant to inspire us to live better lives, not to replace the need to live them. The most beautiful story anyone can experience is their own authentic life, with all its struggles, relationships, and real moments of joy. Ekechi hugged his grandmother tightly, understanding that this story was specifically for him, a traditional tale that spoke directly to his modern experience. The wisdom of his ancestors, passed down through generations, was still relevant in the digital age. On the journey back to Lagos, riding in a crowded Danfo bus that would have annoyed him a year earlier, Ekechi felt grateful for every sensory detail. The smell of roasted corn from roadside vendors, the sound of passengers conversing in multiple languages, the sight of Nigeria's diverse landscape rolling past the windows. These authentic experiences, he now understood, were infinitely more valuable than any artificial substitute. When he returned to his apartment in Surulere, Ekechi felt like he was coming home rather than returning to a prison. The space looked different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because his relationship with it had transformed. It was no longer just a place to consume entertainment, but a home where he lived a real life. He cooked a proper meal, jollof rice with fried plantain, just like Funmi used to make for David, and invited Foleki to share it. As they ate together, talking about their week and making plans for the future, Ekechi realized that this simple domestic scene was more satisfying than any romantic fantasy he had ever watched. "You know," Foleki said as they finished eating, "you've changed so much this past year. You seem more present, more connected to everything around you." "I learned the difference between experiencing life and watching it," Ekechi replied. "And I learned that the people who love you in real life, with all your flaws and struggles, are worth more than any perfect character on any screen." That night, Ekechi did watch Netflix for exactly 1 hour before turning off the television and reading a book, a collection of traditional Nigerian folk tales that his grandmother had given him. The stories were simple compared to modern productions, but they carried wisdom that had helped people navigate life's challenges for generations. As he prepared for bed, Ekechi looked around his apartment with satisfaction. Traditional artwork hung alongside modern technology, but now the balance felt right. He was honoring his heritage while engaging responsibly with modern tools. He was using entertainment to enhance his life rather than replace it. Before sleeping, he called Zainab to tell her about the birthday celebration and to confirm their plans for the upcoming weekend. Then he sent a text to Papa Emeka, thanking him for his concern and wisdom during the crisis. Finally, he set his phone aside and allowed himself to fall into natural, restful sleep. In his dreams that night, Ekechi found himself back in the village, sitting at his grandmother's feet while she told stories under a starlit sky. But this time, when the stories ended, he didn't try to stay in the dream world. Instead, he woke up refreshed and ready to live another day of his authentic life. From that day forward, Ekechi often shared his story with others who seemed to be struggling with similar digital addictions. He would tell them what Papa Emeka had told him, what Mama Elewe had taught him, and what he had learned from David in that strange space between reality and fiction. "Entertainment is like palm wine," he would say, borrowing his grandmother's wisdom. "Sweet and enjoyable in small amounts, but too much will make you forget who you are and where you belong." The goal isn't to never drink palm wine, but to drink it in a way that enhances your connection to your community rather than separating you from it. Some people listened and made changes to their own habits. Others dismissed his story as the fantasy of someone who had watched too much science fiction. But Ekechi didn't mind whether people believed the supernatural elements of his experience. What mattered was that they understood the underlying truth, that authentic relationships and real experiences are irreplaceable treasures that no digital substitute can match. Years later, when Ekechi had married Folake and they were raising children of their own, he would tell them carefully selected stories from movies and shows, but always with context and always followed by real-world activities. He wanted them to enjoy the magic of storytelling while understanding that they were the protagonists of their own lives. And when his children were old enough to understand, he told them about his 3 lost days, about David, and about the choice between living life and watching it. He taught them that technology was a powerful tool that could connect them to the world or isolate them from it, depending on how they chose to use it. Most importantly, he made sure they spent time with Mama Elewe, learning traditional stories that carried the wisdom of their ancestors. These stories, Ekechi understood, weren't just entertainment but survival tools, guides for navigating life's complexities with wisdom, courage, and connection to community. The greatest lesson Ekechi carried from his experience was simple but profound. No matter how beautiful the dream, no matter how perfect the fantasy, no matter how entertaining the escape, the dreamer must always choose to wake up and tend to his responsibilities in the real world. Because it is only in the real world, with all its imperfections and challenges, that genuine love, authentic growth, and meaningful connection are possible. What lessons did you learn from Ekechi's story? Please share them with us in the comment section below. I also want to remind you that giving up on your real life is never the solution. You are not meant to live in fantasy forever, and whatever situation you're going through in the real world can become a stepping stone to a brighter, more authentic future. Be sure to watch more interesting stories on this channel, and please subscribe to this channel. Thank you for watching. God bless you. I love you all.